Hi, I'm Andrew Mack, the founder and managing editor of Loblolly Press. Welcome to Loblolly Press in Conversation, our first episode. Today's conversation is incredibly special to me. It's with our founding poet, Earl J. Wilcox. He's the author of The Surfacing of Joy, which we published in 2023. I say he's our founding poet because working with him, putting together his collection, and then releasing it under Loblolly Press was one of the true joys of my life, and also such a special time, I think, for him. I started receiving poems from Earl in 2015, 2016, as I graduated college and moved all around the country. Knowing his poems were in my inbox, they were always something I could read, gave me an incredible sense of being home. And when I returned to Rock Hill a few years later, started working with Earl on editing some of his poetry and getting it into one single collection. That collection ended up being The Surfacing of Joy, which he funded and helped us publish, which then paved the way for us being able to do the work we do today with so many other writers. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We're a new podcast, so like, subscribe, download, all of those things really do help us. You can also give us a follow on Instagram at Loblolly_press or my personal account at AndrewMack_poetry. And while I'm not a professional audio editor, I do hope that you feel like the podcast sounds good. And I do like interviews that are quite lightly edited. So you may find that Earl and I go off into several different directions at different times, but that's actually just what a conversation with Earl is like. Okay, enjoy.
It's a rare topic. Not many people actually have conversations about poetry.
Not anymore, huh?
Particularly two poets, two writers who think a lot about the same thing, which means it's always on your mind.
So what's on your mind right now?
Well, relative to writing, my brain is always looking at the world in terms of imagery. And that means a lot of colors or a lot of motion. That's motion, not emotion. How things are moving about. And at a holiday season in particular, there always seems to be something going on that's not spoken about.
It is a hallmark of your poetry that it is about things that are happening right now, not just for you, but about the world. So
Yes.
When you first started writing poetry, was it current events that inspired you to do that? What were the things that, made you want to start writing poetry, and when did you start?
That is true. When I first started writing, when I was about 70 or 71, about 20 years ago, I kept noticing a website that had called New Verse News, and it was about current events, short poems, short lyrical poems about events of the day. And I realized that I thought a lot about the events of the day, and I thought but I had never written a poem about them. So I just started trying to do that. And the first two or three that I did, they came back. The editor wrote back and had some nice thing to say, but said, we can't use this at this time, whatever, which told me that I needed to learn how to write poetry. I had the impulse, I had the information, I had a topic, all those things. So I had to find a person who could look at my poetry and say, well, here's what you need to do with this poem. And quite by coincidence, I remember that I had a friend that I was in graduate school with who had written poetry and fiction, and I don't know how I found her, but I did, and I started sending her poetry. And she became the person who really inspired and taught me and showed me the way I could turn my thoughts into a poem.
Is this Joanne?
That's
Joanne Bradham.
Joanne Bradham.
Bradham? Yeah, so you dedicated your first book to her, The Surfacing of Joy, and you said, many of the poems in this book were always read by a talented writer and smart academic friend from our days as graduate students at Vanderbilt, starting 6 decades ago. For her always careful reading, fearless with grace and tact, coupled with humor and constructive insight, all my poems owe their best lines to the late Jo Allen Bradham.
That's the one, yeah. And she was so good. Sometimes she'd be very concise and say, well, there are too many things that need to be redone, so I'll just say, you need to rewrite this poem. Or she would say, this is really good, send it somewhere. And then, but most of the time, it was in between. She would say, well, here's some things that could be done. And she would tell me. And once in a while, there were things that I didn't want to do because I thought they would change the poem too much to do the way she wanted to do them. But anyway, I did learn how to write poetry from being a critic before. I'd written all kinds of literary criticism, but I'd never really tried to write poetry. Though I realized how much I knew about poetry by teaching poets. I knew all kinds of things about it, but I was always using it as a way to understand somebody else's poem. So the tricky thing was to turn what I knew about worked and didn't work in poetry versus putting it down in my own language in the subjects that I wanted to write about. And so much of that was unconscious in a way that I didn't realize myself who the important voices that I heard were until someone would say, this sounds a lot like somebody, and they would mention a poet of some sort. I know that's how I came backed into understanding how Robert Frost got into my mind.
Yes.
And I resisted that for a long time, and I didn't need to because the influence was already there. And I resisted it because he was a great rhymer, and I did not like that kind of poetry, but it was him.
You resisted wanting to be like his poetry because even though you're, a great lover of Robert Frost, you didn't want to mimic his rhyme scheme or his subjects. Or
that's exactly right. Yeah, that as I formed in the field to me, and I knew that there was no way I could be my own voice once his was out there. They would choose him. But and I didn't realize until I read poems like "Why Fallen Leaves Matter," how much that is like a mending wall. And I did not realize till years after I wrote that poem, how much it was like the narrator of that poem talking about his neighbor who came out in spring to move the rocks around, like me looking at my neighbor out with his leaf blower. How it just happened.
Should we read that one? Should we read
Sure.
Why Fallen Leaves Matter?
Sure.
This is Why Fallen Leaves Matter from Earl's collection, The Surfacing of Joy. My neighbor across the street is out to clear the landscape. His leaf blower hums an autumn tune as he rushes to keep up with the fallen leaves from his maples and dogwoods. Sometimes he seems to hide inside, calculating how many to let fall before hustling out to rake up or blow and bag a russet red, tiny filigree fan drifting haphazardly earthward. I ought to walk over to his yard, say something wise like, what's the harm in letting the leaves lie fallow a few days until they cover his fading grass, now turned dark, brown as the ground underneath the trees. I might bravely offer to help him round them up if he'd just allow the leaves be, let them cluster together, family-like, taking their own good time to turn into radiant, fallen stars, lying calmly on our mellow earth, gathering up our senses, ripening and seasoning for all to see.
Yeah.
What do you like most about that poem that you wrote?
Some of the sounds that you get, some of the sounds of it. I think the image is good. All the detail about leaves intrigued me when I was writing it. What are the things you can say about a leaf? What does this leaf look like? I was trying to fix it, not just say it's got a pretty color, or it looks like a leaf. What there was there are things about a leaf you can describe. And again, I didn't realize how much that was like the narrator in Mending Wall talking about all those rocks. So the rocks became leaves, and I was just totally dense, not realizing that I was doing what he had done, but it never occurred to me that I was echoing in some way Frost when I was writing that poem.
Could you talk a little bit about where, you mentioned the same place a lot in your work, your house. A lot of your poems are written from the perspective of looking out the window at your house or that particular place. So what is the role of place in your poetry? And maybe tell us a little bit about that house and how you came about it.
Yeah, place is very important. I was always conscious of place when I was reading other people's poems, not only Frost, but other poets that I taught over the years. I always have to explain to students mostly about a Shakespeare or an Irish writer, they seem to know intuitively or in practice or had taught it before or knew about New England, but they almost never knew anything about England. So you have to stop and talk about allusions and references to them. So I was aware of that when I was writing. Most of my poems were written in a little room next to the kitchen. And so I realized how often I would look up and see the refrigerator or the floor or the coffee pot or something, or look out that window, and I realized I was identifying a place almost as surely as Frost or Shakespeare or an Irish writer was, because it was where I was at the time when I was creating the poem.
But also a place you had lived for so long that you were intimately familiar with literally every single piece of the space around you, not just inside the house, but you were a great gardener, landscaper. You spent tons of time looking out the window, but also sitting in the sunroom. So it was a place that you knew intimately just from being there for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And they're very commonplace things, which I didn't mind doing, because I think that was important, because it was the sense of what I felt and saw when I was creating the poem. It's a real secret of a poem, I think, is for the poet to be familiar enough with that place where he is and where he is in relation to the world around him. I would say that particularly affected me when I realized I was getting older and that I didn't look at the world the same. And I started to lose my vision. I could not see nearly as well when I was 70 or 75 or 80 or 90 as I could when I was 35 or 40. And the whole world started to take different forms and shapes and meanings to me because of the aging, and also because I realized that things were changing, had changed a lot over the years when I first started writing poetry till I got to the end of it. During that 20 years period, a lot of things changed, but some things didn't. I realized when we were doing this poem, and we were talking about the last poem in the book called The Three Little Words, and I was reciting kind of a one-day routine and getting up in the morning all the way, step by step, from the time I went out to the mailbox to get the paper to looking all the way back to it, how much all that came to me so familiar. It was like I was just breathing what I did every day. And many of my poems do have that same kind of characteristic, which I think is one of the reasons that the ordinary reader, that is, a person who does not ordinarily read poetry, they could pick up one of these poems, and while they don't even know me, they feel like they know me through the poem, which is a really a kind of a grateful feeling that I have when I meet somebody and they say, "Oh, you're the one who wrote that poem about so-and-so," which just always stuns me. But I now understand why they say that.
I mean, you use really incredible, simple, evocative imagery that I think anybody might recognize, like how many mornings he's fed the dog and cat, measures how many tiny ladles of coffee he's scooped into the paper vat, estimates the cups of water to pour into the pot. You know, how many times have all of us gotten up in the morning and made coffee or fed the animals or any of those things? So the last three lines ends with, was it Frost who said about life he could sum up what he'd learned in 3 words? It goes on. And we really were very intentional about wanting to choose that as the ending poem, not only because, you know, we know you're a great scholar of Frost, but because he's such an influence, and a lot of your poems are about that. Life is hard and these difficult things happen to us, but it goes on.
It is interesting that I do kind of think it's a male point of view. Most of my poems are, but I never thought about that. It was just me, not some other genre of person. It was just me. So,
well, I think because you write about, your poems are quite autobiographical in the sense that even though you're writing about current events and things that are happening around you, they're from your perspective. So, I mean, not all poems are like that. You know, poems are imaginative, inventive, and they create new places and new worlds, and your poems tend to reflect real life.
Yeah.
Is that something that you intentionally did, or is that a thing that just happened because that's how you write poetry?
Yeah, I think I don't really know how I write poetry anymore as much as I thought I did at first. I used to think when I was first writing that you had to craft a poem. I could think about it long enough and I could write a poem. Well, it does not always work that way. Sometimes the idea comes to you and you never can quite fill up the rest of it. Needs to be something more goes with the poem than just the idea or the ending. Still, the real heart of the poem is what's in between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
And while that doesn't always leave you, that's the hard part of the poem.
It is.
Yeah, you get the idea,
yep,
and you know where it's going, but then you have to figure out how's it going to get there.
Sure.
It's like fiction the same way.
It is.
There's writers who say, I know what the last paragraph is. I got the last paragraph, but I've got about 100 pages to get there to it. And that is kind of the way the creative process works for a lot of artists.
John Irving writes backwards, he says, right? John Irving says he writes the last line of his book before he writes anything that comes before it.
I can believe it.
And I think sometimes yours and my process is very similar in poetry of having the idea, the impetus, there's an inspiration. I call that the gathering. That's when you start bringing the things in that you want to write about. And sometimes you know the ending because the ending is the thing that's going to make the poem stick for the reader. So sometimes the idea you have is the ending, or other times it's the beginning. But you're right that the hard part is making it interesting all the way through.
In some ways that happens. There are probably several poems in there that work their way finally through, into things. And that can happen when you're younger, but it's more difficult when you get to be my age. When you're in your 90s and you don't see very well, it's very difficult not to have I have the patience to still do it, but I don't have quite the insight enough to know if I've gotten where I should be with the line that follows and comes before. I like the line, but then I've got to find something that goes with it.
You've talked about, aging in the process of losing your sight a few times now. And I was wondering if you could speak to how that transition has played a role in your poetry between being able to really see. Maybe could you share kind of what your story with your vision is so that people can understand some of your poems are actually about this loss of sight.
My vision has deteriorated very, very slowly. So at first, as it was getting where I could not see just light, it's gotten to the point now where I cannot see a whole letter in a word. So that's a long transition in between, a matter of years, I would say, more than just weeks or months. It's a matter of years.
Starting in your 70s, or when did
it
begin?
No, it really didn't start till I was about 85. So it was about 7 or 8
years ago.
Yeah. And it's not fast. It's a slow loss of things. I ask myself this question all the time: does it discourage me because I can't see as well? Does that make me not want to do the work? Because doing a good poem is hard work. You have got to stay with it for more than just a few seconds. You've got to stay with it for minutes or hours or days at a time. And if you're having, it is like having a bad leg or a sore shoulder or something. The vision keeps coming back at you. It doesn't go away. It's there all the time. So you have to be concerned about that as you're trying to put together a line. And it has a mental component that sort of makes you slow down, or you don't want to finish it because you're so impatient with it. And I think it's changed my enthusiasm, not my desire to write, or not my thinking about writing and talking about writing, and that, which is for me an encouraging sign. It means that all the impulses are still there, and at some point I will get, I think, back to the point where I want to write so much, so badly, that I'll just say, what the heck, I can write a poem. My poems might simply be shorter, might be shorter lyrical poems, which is a perfectly fine thing. I mean, ask Emily Dickinson. She never wrote a long poem in her life, and she had hundreds and thousands of poems, and she had a lot of handicaps. Vision was not one of them, but other kinds of handicaps that she must have pushed through every day of her life.
Yeah, I think of Mary Oliver, who wrote much shorter poems at the end of her life, and Toni Morrison, much shorter novels at the end of her life. I think that it is a process of, those physical limitations become a bit of a barrier, but they also become a limitation that you work within. What do you wish that maybe younger poets or readers understood about the aging process?
I think they should find out more about themselves. What do I know about life that I have learned in the years? I would say you're keenly aware that you are aging when you get to be about 80. I don't know, to a lot of people that seems like the end of life, but it's really not. 80 is, not at all. Some would say 60 is or 70, but you start when you learn about yourself and what your limitations are in a way you never thought about before. You're always thinking about the positive things and how many things you can do and what you can accomplish and how to get there and succeed in doing those kinds of things. So what you have to do is modify all that and say, what can I do at this point that will still satisfy me and be useful and beneficial to the world around me, and not just fold up my hands and say, well, it's over. I've done my share. I don't have to do anything else. I cannot imagine doing that.
Changing topics just a little bit, thinking about your work as a scholar, which was your career, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you spent how many years?
45 years of teaching.
45 years of teaching.
Yes.
Tell us about some of that and how it's influenced your poetry. Not just teaching, but your research into, your dissertation was on Jack London and the naturalists, and you're a founder of the Robert Frost Society and
Mm-hmm.
conference.
Well, I think the big contribution to anything that I do as a poet is always measured now by something I probably read in the days when I was writing criticism or reading criticism or talking to students about it. I knew what kinds of outcomes you would get in a line of poetry or with a word or with an image that I had studied or taught to students. And that's very, very important, very significant in any writer's toolbox. I think the more than aging it's what you expose yourself to when you are young or at a certain age, particularly an avid reader. And that I cannot imagine any person who would ever be a writer who is not also an avid reader. And you have all that in your mind and your thought as you're trying to create your own work. You're always aware that probably somebody else has talked about this, and your challenge is to not ignore that, but to be aware of it, and you're aware of it in a way that reinforces the way you try to construct a line or think about a poem.
Tell us about The Surfacing of Joy, your first collection, how it came about, and how it kind of played into the start of Loblolly Press.
Mm.
You're our co-founder.
Yes. Okay. The Surfacing, you're talking about the book or the poem?
I think the poem, the book.
Oh, yeah.
The book. We will also read the poem at the end, but
okay.
I want to talk about the book.
Well, one of our co-editors, Dr. Laura Jones, said to me at some point, she must have concluded that I had a lot of poems somewhere, and I said, "Yeah, there's a batch of them somewhere, but I never thought of an anthology." So she suggested, "Well, you probably should." I mean, really, she was just kept, prodding me to do that kind of thing. So I said, "Well, I've made copies of a lot of them, got them just thrown into a batch somewhere." She said, "Why don't you bring them to me, and we'll look at them?" And I said, "Well, you sure you want to do that?" "Oh, yeah." So I took her 450 poems or some number like that, and said, "Well, here they are." And she hadn't read any of my poems, I don't think, until that time. I don't think she'd ever seen one of them. I don't think any of my colleagues ever saw any of my poems, because I wrote them all after I retired. I'd been retired for 10 or 15 years before I started writing poetry. So I gave her the poems, and she went through them and came up with a number of about 150 or 200 that she thought were really good.
It was 190.
190.
It was around 190, yes.
And at some point, the two of you came up with a magic match of some sort. And so we decided this is what the book is going to be like. And then we started poem by poem going through what editors and writers do.
Back and forth, editing every poem, working on it together. Yeah.
Yep. And that's what we're doing with the second one at some point.
Yes, we are working on the second one.
And this second one contains several poems that were in that original batch that didn't make the
there are
cut.
quite a few. There are a few from the original batch that didn't make the first collection. Really excellent poems that just we didn't have the space to publish.
Yeah,
and that's why we're working on a second one now.
The thing that inspires me to keep writing is that I know some people like the poems, and they, for some reason or other, it makes some part of their day a better day. They read a poem. And I've been particularly aware of that when I get on the elevator here and somebody sees my name tag and they'll say, "Are you the one who wrote this poem about something?" And it's it can be a man. In fact, most often it's a man who speaks to me about poetry than a woman, which is an anomaly in this world. But apparently either the husbands or the brothers or somebody, people live here, or I think maybe the women are just too shy to talk about it, but the men will say something and they'll say, "You're the one who wrote this poem." In fact, the other day I found this volume of Surfing of Joy in the dining room, sitting on a table there.
Someone had been reading it?
And I picked it up, and it was really dog-eared everywhere. This book had been through the mill somewhere or the other. And I said, one of the servers said, "Wait a minute, I have something for you." And she handed me a copy of the book. She said, "Is this yours?" I said, "What do you mean yours?" She said, "Didn't you write these poems?" I said, "Oh, yeah." She said, "Well, somebody was reading this to somebody in the dining room today, sitting at the table and had this book open and was reading this poem to them." And I said, "Well, that's really interesting to know."
It's special.
Yeah. So that's almost worth the second book, just knowing that you have some kind of impact on other people.
Should we read The Surfacing of Joy?
Sure. You read it.
Let me read it. This is the title poem. It's also the first poem in the collection. The Surfacing of Joy. The irresistible urge comes to you when you are overcome, overwhelmed, when your vision and hearing are blurred, when smell and sounds and touch explode, when you see in the ordinary lull of life a simple act, such as a butterfly wobbling lazily over the windy day surface of the bird bath, and your view turns a creature into joy. When a boy in a kilt plays a hymn in a cemetery, and your own boy lies in a box before you, there but gone forever, and you have only vague, hushed memories of his laughter, his hug, and his holiness. Your task may unfold bit by bit, echo by echo. Begin. Oh, do not think it will be easy, this unblurring and unlocking, the making and hearing and seeing and surfacing of joy. To grasp it, hold tight to a handle. It really is the perfect poem to start the collection. Can we talk about Betty?
Sure. Yeah. She was also one of my dear wife was one of the first people to ever read my poems too. Almost without exception, when I would write a poem, even if it was the first draft or the last draft, she was sitting out on the sun porch reading or watching TV, and I would just print out a copy and just take it out and hand it to her. And more than once, she certainly said, "Well, I don't like this poem," or "This doesn't work," or "I don't understand this line." Some critique that was a fresh set of eyes seeing that poem. It was never going to be like Joe Allen Bradham, whom I dedicated this book, but it was always an insight of some sort that I took very seriously and thought of her. In fact, in some ways, I should have dedicated the book to her and Joe Allen, because Betty certainly saw every poem. She saw them before Joe Allen did, but she would never have been happy thinking that she was actually critiquing them. She just was reacting to the poem.
As a reader.
Yeah, as a reader. And frequently they were on a subject that she knew something about. If there was something bad happened in our backyard or happened to us, or she certainly would have understood Surfacing the Joy, because it's about that allusion to the death of our son is in that poem. And I don't think she ever saw that poem, actually. I don't think that poem had been completed when she passed away.
You've written quite a few poems about grief and the passing of your son and Betty, and it is a topic that comes up quite a lot. Is it something that you felt came up naturally, or is it a way that you processed the grief?
Well, I didn't think much about it until our son passed away when he was only 34. And that was very heavy on my mind for a long time. And it was a grieving process that did not work very well for me and for her either. And I think it was just because he was so young and our firstborn and all those kinds of things that go with it. And I certainly could not write about it until many years down the road. So that illusion of searching joy was like probably 20 years after he passed away. I could not possibly have written about it before. I'm always a great admiration for people like Frost and Galway Connell and Richard Wilbur, to name three poets that I like a lot. They have had a lot of sadness in their life and were able, some way or the other, to move on, to go on to it goes on, as Frost said, but able to process it and realize it was a part of existence. And I would say the only way to understand grief is see it in the total picture of life. If you don't see it that way, then it's always going to be there with you. And so there's no way something like that wouldn't have an impact, even if you couldn't articulate it. That's the hardest part for a poet, is to be able to articulate how the process works and how it comes and goes, or how it never leaves you. And it doesn't. Some people never get through it. I think that's true too.
Yeah. Seems like you were able to write about Betty shortly after she passed. And I was wondering if I could read A Rare South Star,
sure,
about how you two met.
Yeah. Teenagers. Yeah.
You met very young.
Yeah.
This poem actually is about your honeymoon.
Oh, yes.
In Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
O Rare South Star. Elvis was still a teen in Tupelo almost 70 years ago, the week you and I spent in Memphis. Daytime we strolled hand in hand through Beale Street, no clue about B.B. King, rock and roll, or blues. Newly married, we snuggled one evening in a swanky movie house to watch Bert and Deborah make out on a wet beach as warplanes threatened their torrid affair. In your folks' borrowed Chevy sedan, the two of us owned Memphis, awed by the Pink Palace, before catching the Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn glam and searing fling through Rome. Some lovers' stars are aligned, others seem crossed, surely as galaxies burnish, then fade. Rare stars never grow dim.
Yeah, that's a poem that I would say almost wrote itself as I started writing that poem, as I thought about that week that we were there and all the things that we saw and how they became over the years. We were married 65 years before she died. And all those years, we started thinking about our marriage, how quickly we got married after we had met, that we recalled so many details about that time. We'd been to Memphis before as kids, but not under those conditions. So the conditions made the poem, not just part of a honeymoon, because the movies and the walks and all the things that make for a good place poem. It says a lot about Memphis in that, and the time that it was written. It wrote itself almost.
Your love wrote itself, and so it is fitting that the poem that comes of that, and there are many poems about Betty in the collection, it makes sense that it would be as easy as that. Although I would say, you've told me like that your marriage was not always easy. It was not always that beautiful meeting at a diner where you were the short order cook in the back and Betty walks in and requests a Coke, and that's the first thing you hear, which there's a poem about that. It wasn't always that.
That's true. That's exactly right. I think what we had was sort of a normal marriage once we grew up.
You were so young.
We were just barely beyond being teenagers when we got married. And I'm sure that most of our relatives had a big family, and she only had one brother. But a big family, they expected us not to stay together or to have 5 children, then divorce, or all kinds of things. But none of that happened. With the way people envisioned it in the 1950s, we were lucky in that respect. And that poem that we have not read yet, have we? About love and hurricane season.
We haven't.
Suggests something of the mature. I would say it's the flip side of the poem about Memphis. That's the young people. This is
the older folks.
50 years later, thinking about what happens now after all those years.
Tell us about what inspired you to write Love and Hurricane Season.
Well, our house was really caught up in a huge hurricane called Hurricane Hugo. And all the houses on our street were damaged in some way. We lost 18 trees in our yard. Almost every tree in our yard was destroyed. And we thought we were going to be destroyed too. It was very, very enigmatic and frightful and everything you can say about living through a hurricane. And that made a very deep impression on us, so that whenever any kind of hurricane came along, first thing that we thought of, I'm sure, was how much it made us closer and feeling more special to each other, because we always thought it was probably going to be the end, particularly with Hurricane Hugo. Whenever we could hear all the trees falling, and when we got up the next day and saw the havoc, it was just like World War II had bombed it all. It's going to have an impact on you unless you're just totally inept about the world and don't realize what has happened and how you have survived it. And granted, our house was not damaged at all. We didn't lose any cars, though there were 4 cars in the driveway next door. All had a tree in them. All the houses had trees in them, and ours just somehow miraculously escaped all that. So when you look down the road and you come to a hurricane again, you begin to say, well, that's a hurricane, and this is a hurricane. This second hurricane looks very different for some reason or the other. And it's because you're older, you're more mature, you feel more stable. You think you know and understand the world in a way that you didn't. The earlier one was, like 1989. See how long ago that was. And from 89 back to when we got married was also a long time ago. So it seemed like, and I have no idea. I think that poem came about when she and I were having a conversation like you and I are now having about hurricanes and damages and storms and things of that sort. So it seemed like a natural thing to do it, to talk about how there's a semblance of some kind of what that hurricane does stand for in the long haul, the long path down the road. And if 2 people who have gone through those kinds of things, they understand and know it. It took my grandchild a long time to understand that conversations that she heard her grandparents having were not really arguments. They were discussions, but she had never heard adults discuss things the way we talked about them. We just were very, very open and frank and focused about things when we talked about them. And she was very, very active in politics and sort of dragged me into it. Even though I'd been interested, I was not actively interested until as she was all of her life. And so, not that we were disagreeing about the political party, but I just was not as involved in it as she was from time to time. And I sometimes didn't quite understand. She would go to great lengths to help somebody get elected or whatever was going on in the political world.
Yeah.
So that poem is a kind of a catch-up of some of all that in a nugget of a poem.
Should we read that one?
Sure, yeah.
It's called...
I don't remember much about it.
Well, now you're going to hear it out loud. This will be in your next collection. It'll be... it's coming out in June. We don't have a title yet, but how did this get published?
I don't know. Probably might have been in the New Verse News.
Well, this most recent publication, because it's also following a hurricane that we had in Asheville in the Western North Carolina.
Yeah, you need to talk about that.
Yeah, well, we Loblolly Press released a zine. It was originally supposed to be a very small digital zine that included a few select contributors from the press. I emailed Earl and Clint and Cheryl and Emma, and I asked if anyone wanted to contribute a poem, and we were publishing it, and any of the proceeds from the sales would go straight to hurricane relief. And I got this one from Earl. Actually, I picked this one out because this is the one that I liked most, and also it's appropriate. But we ended up getting 87 different contributors for this, so over almost 200 pages. But this is love in hurricane season. And I will watch the spindly pine trees shrug and quiver when the thrust of wild wind 100 miles per hour slashes across our back orchard and beyond. And I will speak softly, calmly to you, hold my heart, your hand if necessary, when the thunder rolls, the bolts of blue skies slice across our soggy zoysia grass, greening. And I will never let you go again until the next hurricane, whether this year or a century from now, when you and I and all that's ours takes us safely home. That's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Takes you right back, huh?
Yes, it does.
And that's our interview with Earl J. Wilcox. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I wanted to let you know that if you go over to our website, loblollypress.com, you can get a copy of The Surfacing of Joy for 20% off for the entire month of February. This episode was produced, edited, and mastered by me, Andrew Mack, from my home in Asheville, North Carolina. Loblolly Press is dedicated to amplifying emerging voices from the American South, with a focus on queer, BIPOC, and rural writers. To learn more about our books, writers, and upcoming projects, visit loblollypress.com and subscribe to our newsletter over on Substack. You can also follow us on Instagram at loblolly_press for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and a whole lot more. If you enjoyed this episode, please do consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. It helps us reach more listeners and support the writers we love. Again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next month.